Life has a peculiar way of serving justice, especially when it comes to those who abuse their privilege and power over others. In a quiet suburban neighborhood where perfectly trimmed lawns and white picket fences created an illusion of harmony, one resident's sense of entitlement was about to lead them down a path they never expected. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Alex, a hard-working contractor, pulled up to his latest job site. Having recently started his own home renovation business, every client mattered. This particular project, repairing an elderly couple's leaking roof, was exactly the kind of meaningful work he loved doing. The couple, both in their 70s, had saved for months to fix their roof before winter arrived. As Alex unloaded his tools from his well-worn pickup truck, he noticed a woman watching him intently from behind her curtains across the street. He thought nothing of it at first. New faces in the neighborhood often drew attention, but something about her stern expression and the way she kept peeking out made him uneasy. He had barely set up his ladder when the woman emerged from her house, smartphone in hand, marching toward him with the confidence of someone who believed they owned not just their property, but the entire street. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the morning air. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" Alex, always professional, explained his purpose with a smile, even showing her his contractor's license and the signed agreement from the elderly couple. But the neighbor wasn't interested in facts. In her mind, someone like Alex, in his work clothes, driving an older truck, couldn't possibly have legitimate business in her prestigious neighborhood. What happened next would become the talk of the community for months to come. The neighbor, without hesitation, dialed 911, claiming there was a suspicious person attempting to break into homes. Alex, remaining remarkably calm, continued setting up his equipment while recording the interaction on his phone, a habit he'd developed after years in customer service. Little did the neighbor know, but karma was already in motion. The elderly couple's grandson happened to be a well-respected local news reporter. Their security cameras captured every moment of the neighbor's behavior, and as police cars pulled up to the scene, responding to her call, an unexpected twist awaited everyone involved. The officers who arrived weren't strangers to the neighborhood. In fact, Officer Chen had personally hired Alex the previous month to renovate his mother's bathroom. As the situation unfolded, the neighbor's face began to change from smug satisfaction to growing horror. But this was just the beginning of her problems. Her false report would have consequences far beyond what she imagined. The elderly couple's grandson, the security footage, the responding officer's body cameras, and Alex's own recording would all play crucial roles in what was about to unfold. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, no one present could have predicted how this incident would not only transform their quiet suburban street, but also spark a viral conversation about privilege, prejudice, and the power of community. What happened next would leave the entitled neighbor wishing she'd never peeked through those curtains that morning. But more importantly, it would remind everyone that in a world where negativity often seems to win, justice and human decency still have a way of prevailing. The story continues with the reveal of immediate consequences in Part 2. As Officer Chen approached the scene, his presence immediately changed the dynamic. The neighbor, who had introduced herself as Mrs. Thompson, was mid-sentence in explaining her concerns when she noticed the familiar way the officer greeted Alex. Her voice trailed off as she realized this situation wasn't going to play out as she planned. "Alex, how's my mother's bathroom coming along?" Officer Chen asked with a warm smile, completely ignoring Mrs. Thompson's attempts to interject. She can't stop showing pictures to everyone at her church group. The other responding officer, trying to maintain his professional composure, couldn't help but crack a slight smile at the unexpected turn of events. Meanwhile, the elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Rivera, had emerged from their home, visibly distressed by the police presence. Their grandson Michael, the news reporter, had arrived moments earlier for his regular weekend visit. As he witnessed the scene unfolding, his journalistic instincts kicked in, recognizing this was more than just a neighborhood dispute. What Mrs. Thompson didn't realize was that her actions that morning weren't isolated incidents. Security footage from multiple neighbors would soon reveal a pattern of similar behavior spanning months. She had appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial security guard, but her selective enforcement of her imagined rules had raised eyebrows among many residents. As Officer Chen reviewed Alex's documentation and the work contract, Mrs. Thompson's face flushed red with each passing moment. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her accusations. "Well, how was I supposed to know?" she demanded, her voice rising. "This neighborhood has standards, and I'm just trying to protect our property values." The irony of her statement wasn't lost on anyone present. The Rivers had lived in their home for over 40 years, long before the neighborhood had become prestigious. They had watched as modest family homes were torn down and replaced with luxury builds, as neighbors they'd known for decades were priced out of their own community. Michael, standing beside his grandparents, was quietly documenting everything. His years of reporting on community issues had taught him that stories like this needed to be told. But what he didn't know yet was that his inbox already contained similar complaints about Mrs. Thompson from other service workers and delivery personnel who had experienced her concerned citizen routine. Officer Chen's partner had stepped aside to take statements from other neighbors who had gathered to watch the commotion. Each conversation seemed to add another layer to the story. The quiet murmurs and head shakes from the onlookers suggested that many had witnessed similar incidents but had never spoken up. Alex, despite the interruption to his workday, maintained his composure. He'd faced discrimination before, but something felt different this time. The support from the community, the presence of Michael with his media connections, and the undeniable evidence capturing Mrs. Thompson's behavior. It all seemed to be converging toward something bigger than just another confrontation with an entitled neighbor. As the morning wore on, more residents emerged from their homes, many approaching Officer Chen to share their own experiences. Mrs. Thompson's facade of neighborhood protector was crumbling by the minute. But as she stood there, watching her carefully constructed image dissolve, she had no idea that her actions were about to trigger a chain of events that would reshape not just her life, but the entire community's approach to inclusion and acceptance. The tension in the air was palpable as Officer Chen finished gathering statements. He turned to address Mrs. Thompson, his expression serious. What he was about to say would set in motion consequences that nobody saw coming. Officer Chen's words cut through the morning air with practiced precision. "Mrs. Thompson, making false police reports is a serious offense." He paused, letting the weight of his statement sink in. "We've received multiple complaints about similar incidents in recent months. This stops today." As if on cue, a sleek news van pulled up to the curb. Michael's producer, having heard about the unfolding situation, had dispatched a crew immediately. Mrs. Thompson's face drained of color as she watched the camera equipment being unloaded. Her perfect neighborhood was about to become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. But the real bombshell was yet to drop. A gentleman in a crisp suit emerged from one of the gathered crowds. Mr. Sullivan, the president of the Homeowners Association. He'd been watching the entire scene unfold from his home office. "Officer," he called out, approaching with a thick folder in hand. "We've been documenting these incidents for the past 6 months." The folder contained dozens of complaints, photos, and even security footage screenshots. Delivery drivers rerouting their routes to avoid Mrs. Thompson's harassment. Landscapers quitting their contracts after being subjected to her interrogations. Even teenagers delivering newspapers had stories to tell about her confrontational behavior. Alex's case wasn't just the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the catalyst that brought everything into the light. The Rivers, standing on their porch, watched as their quiet neighborhood transformed into a stage where years of pent-up frustration and silence finally found their voice. Mrs. Thompson's attempts to maintain control of the situation grew increasingly desperate. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, her voice shaking. "I was just trying to keep our neighborhood safe." But as she spoke, more neighbors stepped forward, phones in hand, ready to share their own recordings of her past confrontations. The most damning evidence came from Mrs. Rivera's healthcare worker, who had quietly filmed several encounters where Mrs. Thompson had demanded to see her credentials and threatened to call the police. The worker, a dedicated professional with 20 years of experience, had nearly quit because of the constant harassment. As Officer Chen reviewed the mounting evidence, his partner was on the radio, discovering that Mrs. Thompson had made 17 police reports in the past year alone, all about suspicious individuals who turned out to be legitimate workers or visitors to the neighborhood. Each false report had wasted valuable police resources and potentially delayed response times to real emergencies. Michael, now fully in reporter mode, was piecing together a story that went beyond one entitled neighbor's actions. It was becoming a narrative about power, privilege, and how silence in the face of discrimination only serves to perpetuate it. His producer was already talking about turning it into a special report on community policing and racial profiling. The tension reached its peak when Mr. Sullivan cleared his throat, holding up another document that would change everything. The Homeowners Association had called an emergency meeting the previous week, unbeknownst to Mrs. Thompson. The subject of that meeting was now becoming crystal clear. Mrs. Thompson's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms as she watched her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. But what Mr. Sullivan was about to reveal would make her previous distress seem trivial in comparison. The consequences of her actions were about to become very real, very public, and very permanent. Mr. Sullivan's revelation sent shockwaves through the gathering crowd. The Homeowners Association hadn't just met to discuss Mrs. Thompson's behavior. They had uncovered something far more disturbing. Her campaign of harassment had extended beyond their neighborhood, leading to serious financial consequences for several small businesses. We've discovered that Mrs. Thompson has been systematically leaving false negative reviews online for every service worker she's harassed, Mr. Sullivan announced, his voice steady but stern. She's effectively been blackmailing local businesses, threatening to damage their reputations unless they meet her increasingly unreasonable demands. At that moment, a familiar face stepped forward from the crowd, the owner of a local landscaping company. His story left everyone stunned. After Mrs. Thompson had threatened his workers and posted devastating reviews, he lost several major contracts. 3 of his employees, all hard-working family men, had to be laid off as a result. Officer Chen's radio crackled to life. The department had run a background check, and what they found changed the entire complexity of the situation. Mrs. Thompson had a history of similar behavior in her previous neighborhood, where she'd been forced to move after legal action from multiple victims of her harassment. The river's security cameras had captured something else, something that made Michael's journalistic instincts go into overdrive. The footage showed Mrs. Thompson selectively targeting certain workers while completely ignoring others. The pattern was clear, disturbing, and impossible to defend. As if the situation couldn't get more intense, a city council member arrived at the scene. She had been contacted by Michael's producer and came to address the growing crowd. The implications of Mrs. Thompson's actions had escalated from a neighborhood dispute to a potential civil rights issue. Alex, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the ordeal, finally spoke up. His words carried the weight of someone who had faced discrimination countless times but had never lost his dignity. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice clear and measured. "This is about every hard-working person who has been judged not by their work, but by their appearance." Mrs. Thompson's facade of righteousness completely crumbled as her phone began buzzing incessantly. The local business owners she had targeted had formed an online group, and their stories were spreading rapidly across social media. Her carefully curated image as a concerned citizen was being replaced by video evidence of her true behavior. The city council member pulled Officer Chen aside for a private conversation, their serious expressions suggesting that the consequences of this situation would extend far beyond their quiet suburban street. Meanwhile, Mr. Sullivan received an urgent call from the HOA's legal team. Just when it seemed the situation couldn't become more complex, Mrs. Thompson's own security cameras had captured something that would turn the entire narrative on its head. The footage, automatically uploaded to her cloud storage, revealed a pattern of behavior that even her most vocal critics hadn't anticipated. As Officer Chen ended his conversation with the council member and approached Mrs. Thompson, the atmosphere grew thick with tension. The truth about her past, her manipulative tactics, and her hidden motives was about to come to light. But the biggest revelation, the one that would leave everyone speechless, was still moments away from being revealed. Officer Chen's expression shifted as he reviewed the footage from Mrs. Thompson's own security system. What they discovered was beyond anything anyone had imagined. She hadn't just been harassing workers. She'd been running an elaborate scheme to drive down property values in specific parts of the neighborhood, working with a shady real estate investor to force certain homeowners to sell. The investor, it turned out, was Mrs. Thompson's brother-in-law, who had been buying properties at reduced prices after her targeted harassment campaigns drove people to sell. The Rivers home had been their next target, which explained her increased aggression toward any worker trying to help maintain their property. "Mrs. Thompson," Officer Chen announced, his voice carrying across the now silent crowd, "you're not just facing charges for filing false police reports. We're looking at harassment, conspiracy, and potential civil rights violations." The color drained completely from her face as she realized her entire scheme had unraveled. Mr. Sullivan stepped forward, holding up a final document, the results of the emergency HOA meeting. "The board has voted unanimously to impose the maximum possible fines for your violations of community guidelines," he stated. "Additionally, we've initiated proceedings to place a lien on your property to compensate the businesses and individuals you've harmed." The city council member, who had been quietly making calls, addressed the gathering. "The city is launching a full investigation into all similar complaints. We're establishing a task force to prevent housing discrimination and protect small businesses from these types of predatory practices." But the most powerful moment came when Alex, still standing by his ladder and tools, made an unexpected offer. "I'd be willing to work with any homeowner who has been affected by this situation," he announced. "At cost, no profit, because that's what community really means." The crowd's response was immediate. Applause broke out, and several neighbors were moved to tears. Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed one final time, a message from her brother-in-law. He had already been contacted by investigators and had agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency. Their entire scheme was exposed, and she stood alone. As Officer Chen began reading Mrs. Thompson her rights, Michael's news crew captured every moment. His producer was already calling it the story of the year, not just about one entitled neighbor's comeuppance, but about a community standing together against discrimination and corruption. The Rivers, watching from their porch, finally smiled. Their grandson had just shown them something on his phone, a spontaneous online fundraiser started by neighbors to help elderly residents with home repairs. Within hours, it had already exceeded its goal. But the final twist came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Thompson's own daughter, a civil rights attorney in another state, arrived at the scene. She had been watching her mother's security camera feed remotely and had immediately flown in when she saw what was happening. "Mom," she said, her voice carrying across the stunned crowd, "this ends today. And you're going to make this right, starting with a public apology to everyone you've hurt." The neighborhood would never be quite the same after that day. But as Alex finally climbed his ladder to begin work on the Rivers roof, surrounded by supportive neighbors and protected by a community that had found its voice, it was clear that the change was for the better. Sometimes, justice comes not from courts or laws, but from ordinary people simply deciding that enough is enough. Mrs. Thompson's story would serve as a powerful reminder that in a world where darkness often seems to prevail, light can shine through when people stand together against injustice. The entitled neighbor who thought she could rule her street through fear and discrimination had instead united a community in ways she never could have imagined. In the weeks that followed that transformative morning, the neighborhood underwent a remarkable change. Mrs. Thompson's daughter, true to her word, ensured that her mother faced the consequences of her actions while also making amends. The restitution process began with personal apologies to each affected business owner, service worker, and neighbor, followed by substantial financial compensation drawn from the sale of her property. Alex's contracting business unexpectedly became the catalyst for healing in the community. The online fundraiser for elderly home repairs had grown beyond anyone's expectations, allowing him to hire several of the previously laid-off landscaping workers as full-time employees. Together, they began restoring homes that had suffered from deferred maintenance due to Mrs. Thompson's harassment campaign. The Rivers home became a symbol of community resilience. What started as a simple roof repair turned into a complete renovation project, with neighbors volunteering their time and skills every weekend. Mr. Rivera, a retired carpenter, found joy in teaching young volunteers his craft, while Mrs. Rivera kept everyone energized with her famous homemade empanadas. Michael's news report aired nationally, but not as the scandal piece it could have been. Instead, it became a powerful story about community transformation and redemption. The footage showed neighbors from different backgrounds sharing meals, working on homes together, and building genuine friendships. The city council used it as a model for community policing and anti-discrimination initiatives. Officer Chen established a new community liaison program, ensuring that service workers and contractors could report harassment without fear of reprisal. The program became so successful that neighboring districts began implementing similar initiatives. Sometimes, he would say at community meetings, "It takes one bad situation to create 100 good solutions." The HOA, under Mr. Sullivan's leadership, underwent its own transformation. The funds from Mrs. Thompson's fines were used to establish a community improvement fund, focusing on helping elderly and fixed-income residents maintain their homes. The program ensured that no one would ever feel pressure to sell their property due to maintenance issues. Mrs. Thompson's brother-in-law's cooperation with authorities led to the exposure of similar schemes in other neighborhoods, resulting in new state legislation protecting homeowners from predatory practices. The investigation revealed a network of housing discrimination that had gone unchecked for years, and its dismantling became a model for other communities facing similar challenges. As for Mrs. Thompson herself, her daughter's intervention proved transformative. Instead of facing jail time, she agreed to participate in extensive community service and anti-discrimination education programs. The woman who once policed for neighbors from behind curtains now volunteers at a community center, helping immigrants and minorities navigate housing regulations and rights. 1 year later, the Rivers hosted a neighborhood block party in their beautifully restored home. Alex, now running a successful contracting company known for its community-first approach, stood chatting with Officer Chen while their children played together on the lawn. The scene was everything their neighborhood had always had the potential to be: diverse, welcoming, and strong. As the sun set on that gathering, Mrs. Rivera shared a final thought with Michael, who was working on a follow-up story. "You know," she said, watching the children play, "sometimes the worst storms bring the most beautiful rainbows. Our neighborhood needed to break before it could truly come together." The entitled neighbor who called the cops that morning never could have imagined that her actions would lead to such positive change. In trying to divide a community, she had inadvertently united it, and in that unity, everyone found something far more valuable than property values or pristine lawns. They found the true meaning of home.